Waldy and Bendy.
Hello and welcome to the first Waldy and Bendy podcast of 2026. So it's a new year, hurrah! But we're still the same old team. I'm still Waldemar Janustak, art critic of the Sunday Times here in London, and I'm joined as always by Scotland's most intelligent farmer, Dr. Bendor Grosvenor, the Einstein of art. Bendy, so are you ready for the new year on the farm? The spring coming up soon, all good news, isn't it?
Yes, I'm going to get out on the land and with my plough, work off all those mince pies. Well, Happy New Year to you, looking very svelte. I don't think you must have indulged very much this Christmas period.
Are you being sarcastic again, Bendor Grosvenor?
No.
You've taken against me. You never miss an opportunity to poke your nail into me. Is
my remarks and affection towards you are genuine, Weld.
Oh, I'm sure as long as you're not getting back at me for those terrible sequence of events last year involving the creature whose name is an anagram of art. So as long as that isn't part of the underpinning of your behaviour. But yes, absolutely fantastic to see you. Christmas was exciting as always, but I'm really excited about the new year. Now, because this is a special New Year episode of the podcast They Could Not Stop, I thought we could look at some of the shows that are coming up in the year ahead. There's plenty to look forward to, Bendy, not just here in the UK, but also far abroad, where all our fabulous international listeners are based. And international listeners, if you're listening, this entire show is dedicated to you. So, Bendy, I mean, there's just basically lots to look forward to, isn't there, in the year ahead?
Oh, so much to look forward to, and as you say, internationally. So let's press on. Are you going to go first, Wild, or
yeah? Well, I thought I would kick things off because I thought I'd like to talk about Tate Modern. Now, we've got a bit of history with Tate Modern recently, haven't we? We had a pop at it, and it led to events which perhaps we can bring up as well. But the thing is, they've got quite a spectacular run of shows coming up. And it almost pains me to say this, but I mean, it's probably one of the best runs of shows at Tate Modern that I remember. So it's all very exciting, and it's dominated by women artists. So first of all, there's Tracey Emin. Okay, I'm not going to talk a lot about her because, first of all, we've done her on the podcast ourselves, haven't we? We've interviewed her, and maybe we'll get another chance to interview her later on, but she's got a great big show coming up in February. And you love her work now, don't you, Bendy? You've been transformed. You've become a Tracey Emin fan.
Honestly, well, I was never a doubter. Tracey is, for me, one of those rare contemporary artists who I've never been in doubt of their brilliance, and I've never been in doubt of the fact that she will continue for long into the future into art history. So, yes, looking forward to this show very much.
Yeah, so that's in February, and that's a big retrospective, the biggest retrospective of her work ever. I think it's going to be underpinned by a sense of where she is now, because there has been a transformation in her career. She's become this figurative painter above all, which surprised some people a few years back. But it should be quite revelatory. Big show at Tate Modern. I'm certainly looking forward to it. And if we're lucky, let's see if we can get Tracey on the podcast, say a few words to us about it. So that's brilliant. But the shows that I wanted to focus on, because this is an international podcast now, and we need to press the buzzers of our lovely international listeners. There's two shows coming up, basically involving Latin American artists. So there's a big Frida Kahlo show coming at Tate Modern. Great big display devoted to Frida Kahlo. Now, everybody loves Frida Kahlo, don't they? Do you remember the other day we watched as one of her paintings broke the record for the most money ever paid for a woman artist? That sale in New York. Do you remember that, Bendy?
Yes, that was a good Frida Kahlo highlight. It eclipsed, happily, that moment where you made me watch... Do you remember, in a past series, you made me watch a terrible film about Frida Kahlo, so it's taken me a while to get over that. But,
yes. That was Selma Hayek's Frida, which I think we voted the very worst artistic biopic of all time, which I have to say, given how strong the contenders are, is quite an achievement.
Big field.
Yeah. It was a terrible film, but she is a wonderful artist, prickly, interesting. The spirit of Mexico runs through her. And there's over 100 paintings, I think 150 paintings or 150 works by her coming to this show. And it's going to be dominated, I think, by, of course, her self-portraits, because she was a pioneer of all sorts of stuff. But I suppose really she brought two things to the table that were exciting. One was this spirit of Mexican revolutionary fervour. Just basically art being really exciting. And the Mexican Revolution had thrown up a marvellous generation of painters, principally people like Diego Rivera, but also Orozco, Siqueiros, and they just made rousing art, especially as muralists. If you're making a mural, it has to be rousing, doesn't it? What's the point of doing a mural if it doesn't engage with people and get them running out and feeling active and interested? And a lot of these murals were deliberately set up to inspire the populace to rise up against the oppressors and to fight the fight for a free Mexico. So they had a rousing spirit to them. And I think some of that continues into the art of Frida Kahlo. But of course, she makes it far more personal because she had this interesting life story. She was injured when she was a kid. She had her legs broken. And she was married to the awful Diego Rivera, who was a great artist, but an unpleasant human being who betrayed her, did all sorts of stuff. That was regrettable. So I think her art turned more and more into herself. And what she really pioneered was this intense self-imaging, the self-portraiture that has now become really pretty much de rigueur in women artists. I mean, there is so much art these days about identity, about self-portraiture, about looking at yourself in the world. But Frida Kahlo, because she was Mexican and also an amazing-looking woman, part of her magic, of course, is her image, this wonderful look she adopted where she tried to present herself as this iconic Mexican figure. So she's an exciting presence, and she produces art that's all about herself. And for me, what I'm really looking forward to are the self-portraits. This one that was sold in New York recently for $55 million, the one that broke the world record for a woman artist, they hope that's going to be in the show. And it's a scene of Frida lying in her tiny little bed in her blue house in Mexico, staring up at a skeleton that's kind of rattling above the bed. So that they hope is going to be in the show, but also her other self-portraits, which do you know them? Do you know her self-portraits, the famous ones where she's kind of just looking at you?
Yeah, there's many of them, aren't there? And the monobrow beaming through.
The monobrow beaming through, lots of them. The ones that are absolutely delightful are the ones where she shares the scene with sort of local animals. Remember, we did one way, way, way back. I think it was one of my early On the Walls, the one where she's on with a couple of parrots. And these are obviously pet parrots that she had. And I think she's sort of presenting herself as this exotic creature from an exotic land and very much trying to position Mexico and her background as a kind of alternative to the quotidian world of Western art, etc. But yeah, so she's done self-portraits with monkeys, with parrots, with all sorts of beautiful exotic Mexican blossoms, casting herself really as this traditional Mexican heroine. But anyway, it's going to be a great show. Imagine 150 Frida Kahlos. So come over in June, folks, June 2026, all you international visitors. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this show. There's going to be 150 works by Frida Kahlo in it, and it's going to be very exciting. And I know Bendy's looking forward to it in particular, aren't you, Bendy?
Very much. See you there.
Yeah, see you there. Now, it so happens that also next year at Tate Modern, apart from the Tracy Emin and apart from the Frida Kahlo, there's going to be an exhibition devoted to an extremely interesting artist called Ana Mendieta. Now, do you know about Ana Mendieta? Have you heard of her?
Not a Scooby-Doo, I'm afraid, Weld.
Well, she was obscure for a while, but not anymore. So she was born in Cuba, so one of these Caribbean artists who are making such an impact in art at the moment. But she left Cuba at a very early age, fleeing the Castro regime, was brought up in America, and basically invented what we might call performance body art. So in the 70s and 80s, Ana Mendieta was the female artist who pioneered the kind of art where artists, women artists principally, would put themselves in their work, often nude, and claimed another journey to identity where I guess they were uniting themselves with what they felt were older forces of goddesses of the earth, of Gaia, and she was pioneering in that. And above all, she made a brilliant series, coincidentally in Mexico, called Her Silhouettes. And in these silhouettes, she would lie down in the mud or something and leave behind this beautiful silhouette, her shape, and that would then be filled with coloured water if the rain fell and maybe things got dispersed in the water. Sometimes she would lie covered in leaves or flowers. And so her body, often her naked body, would haunt the landscape. And she had interesting ideas about this. She used to say that because she'd been forced to flee from Cuba, these works where she's a kind of silhouette embedded in the nature, embedded in the landscape, are a representation really of her being torn away from the land that she should have been in. So fascinating work, very, very influential, and just a little bit reminiscent, I think, of someone I do know you like a lot, and that's Andy Goldsworthy, the Scottish artist Bendy, because he too combines, if you like, his own presence himself with nature that he comes in.
Who was lying naked in the mud first? Wild? Andy or
Anna Mendieta? You couldn't stop her lying naked in the mud very early on. She absolutely pioneered that urge. And lots of women artists after that, took up body art because it was a way of reclaiming the female body from the male gaze as well. Because you always talk to me about rubbing your thigh and all the male gaze and its destructive and overpowering impact on art. Well, one of the ways that women fought against that was by reclaiming the territory with their own bodies, with their own nudity, making their art their way about these subjects. And Anna Mendieta was a pioneer in that. Before we move on I know you've got stuff to talk about, so just very, very quickly, another fascinating but also dark thing about Anna Mendieta is that she was married to an artist called Carl Andre, who's a minimalist artist, very famous, produced a very iconic series of minimalist sculptures called the Tate bricks, so that's the sort of nickname for them. So he was a major pioneering minimalist. They were living together for a while, and then she met a very tragic and mysterious death where she fell out of the balcony of the apartment they shared on the 34th floor in New York and died very early. She was only 37. And it's been very, very, very controversial ever since. Who did what is the question people have been asking. Anyway, sorry to end on that dark note, but it's something that you can't really avoid when you talk about Anna Mendieta, because apart from anything else, her early life robbed the art world, I think, of a very significant figure. So, yeah, two big shows, kind of Caribbean and Mexican in atmosphere, Frida Kahlo and Anna Mendieta at Tate Modern, following on from Tracey Emin. Big year at Tate Modern.
Oh, that all looks like a lot of good things to look forward to at Tate Modern Wild. And there we are. Maria Balshaw, who was resigned as the Tate head honcho, I think this is probably going to be her defining legacy, don't you think, Wild? So although we've been a bit unkind about Tate's overall stewardship the last decade or so, she was always quite open about rebalancing the canon and bringing more female artists to the fore. So to go out in her final year with a show on Tracey Emin, Frida Kahlo and Anna Mendieta, that's quite an achievement, don't you think?
It is. And although I'm sure Maria Balshaw would personally blame you for her departure from the Tate, given the harsh things you said about her on a recent podcast. I think in the end, here we are, one woman out, but 3 women in is a good ratio for Tate Modern. So I'm looking forward to that. What about you? What other shows can we expect to enjoy next year?
Well, actually, I'm going to start in London again. Well, we will go international in a second, but I'm going to start in London because at the National Gallery, Wild, something a little bit more in my scene, an exhibition of paintings of horses. How about that? Actually, it's about George Stubbs, and it's called Stubbs' Portrait of a Horse, and it opens at the National Gallery on the 12th of March. Now, Stubbs, I think, is someone who's absolutely fascinating, and in fact, a pivotal figure in the history of British art. I'll tell you why in just a second, but I'll tell you just a little bit about the show. So you may know, international listeners, that the National Gallery in London has one of the most iconic paintings of a horse ever painted, and it's George Stubbs's giant whistle jacket, which presents this great sort of chestnut stallion rearing up, life-size, but on a plain kind of beige background because the painting is unfinished. So this show is going to include Whistle Jacket, along with another life-size painting of a rearing horse that Stubbs painted at around the same time for the same patron, the Marquis of Rockingham. And this horse is called Scrub. And this painting is in fact finished, so we see Scrub on the painted background. So for the first time, I think, since 1762, we're going to see these pictures reunited together in the National Gallery. So that will be quite a monumental, cinematic even, display of George Stubbs' masterworks. Do you like a Stubbs horse, Wild?
Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I mean, funny enough, I'm not necessarily all that keen on most 18th century English horse painters, because it was a genre, wasn't it? There was a whole kind of thing where the English and the racing classes, they loved to paint their horses. So you'd get these big, flashy portraits of horses, and often they were a bit wobbly. But Stubbs, of course, because he'd taken so much care with his anatomy, he paints these marvellously exact, anatomically perfect, brilliantly, totally convincing horses. And Whistlejacket is the prime example, isn't it? Well, what a painting. Very cinematic almost. It's massive too, isn't it? So it dominates the space where it hangs. So Stubbs is absolutely wonderful. Love Stubbs.
Yeah, and as you say, Stubbs was such an eccentric character. He was so determined to paint horses accurately. And as you say, until then, at least in British art, the paintings of horses had been really quite wonky and not very good at all. The elite classes were becoming obsessed with horse racing, and they used to spend vast fortunes on these thoroughbred horses. And there was a demand to have them painted as well as possible. And Stubbs thought, aha, here's my opportunity. I'm going to meet that demand. But in order to study the best way to paint a horse, he decided that he had to dissect them and get to know them from inside out. So he eschewed all forms of conventional art training, and he ended up buying horses, dead horses, which he would string up in a room next to his house. I think it was in Suffolk. And gradually, over a course of 5 or 6 weeks a time, dissect them and peel them back layer by layer and produce these amazing drawings, which he then engraved, showing the musculature, the bones, the skin, the veins, and everything from the horse. And that became the foundation of his ability to paint horses extremely accurately. But, well, I just want to end this little peroration on Stubbs by saying that the reason he helps advance British art is not in the manner that he painted horses, but in how he displayed the settings that the horses went into. So, Wild, George Stubbs was actually one of the first people in the story of British art to most effectively and brilliantly paint the English landscape as it actually was. Now, the reason this is important is that until this time, the upper classes, the elite classes in England certainly, had been busily decorating their houses with foreign art, old masters, Claude Lorrain's, and insofar as they ever wanted pictures of the landscape world, they tended to have them, Italianate, French landscapes, showing a warmer, happier place. They weren't really interested in landscapes, native landscape, or the English landscape. And George Stubbs was determined to prove them wrong, not least because at the same time as they were busily buying foreign old masters and having themselves painted in the manner of sort of Michelangelo by artists like Joshua Reynolds, it was also, Stubbs showed, ridiculous to try and present a horse in this kind of neoclassical, grand manner, Italianate way. So if you wanted to show your thoroughbred horse looking really realistic, you then also had to drop him into a realistic English landscape. You couldn't have your stallion, Scrub or Whistlejacket, rearing up in the kind of Roman Campagna next to poplar trees and an Italian at sunset. That would have been silly. So Stubbs is actually one of the first people to not only paint brilliant horses, but paint a brilliant English landscape.
And yet, perversely, Bendy, Whistlejacket, the painting we've been going on about, the one that is so amazing and hangs there looking so dramatic at the National Gallery, hasn't got a landscape. And I remember you said to me once that you suspected it was unfinished. And I've always thought you're going to bring this up and reveal it as one of your new crazy ideas, like the one about the swan in the Lawrence picture. But you've been sort of shushing about it ever since. You haven't actually mentioned it again. But I thought at the time, wow, that's such a good suggestion. Because the other painting that you mentioned, Scrubs, the other horse that was painted at exactly the same time for the same patron, that has got a landscape. But when you hang the two together, surely the point will be made that just perhaps it's true. The reason why Whistlejacket is so strikingly set against this very plain, eerie and unusual backcloth is because it's unfinished.
Yeah, we're so determined, I think, these days in contemporary art land, to want everything in the past to be modern and striking. And the fact that Whistlejacket is unfinished and on this plain background makes it feel very modern. And we want to believe that Stubbs was, bucking a trend and having a little experimentation with a modern moment. And he may have been, but in fact, if you look at the way Stubbs painted his pictures, he always does the horse first And then if you look very closely at the junction between the outline of the horse and the landscape background, you can see that he brings the background in afterwards. In fact, sometimes, very occasionally, if he was busy, he would farm out the background to another artist. I think if the patron was being mean and didn't want to pay so much for the picture. So I think that's proof for me that Whistle Jacket is indeed unfinished. But we should...
Our international visitors who are going to turn up and see this show, which of course they should do, they should keep an eye open for that, because if they too think, great painting, Whistle Jacket, but maybe it's unfinished and maybe Bendy was right, then you should give you credit for that, because it's an exciting insight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm glad you think that has legs, that insight.
No, definitely. Listen, talking of artists who bring something different to the party, the other show that I want to talk about, which is at the National Gallery, is the show that's coming up in May devoted to Francisco de Zurbarán. Oh, God, Bendy, I can't wait for this. Zurbarán really is one of my very favourite artists of all time, let alone of the so-called Spanish Golden Age. You love him too, don't you?
Very mysterious. I love a Zurbarán. You could look at them for a long time. There's so many layers to disappear into.
There are indeed. So roughly, international visitors, so his dates are 1598 to 1664. So he had a decent life, right in the middle, as I said, of this period they call the Spanish Golden Age. So that's the era of Velázquez, Zurbarán, and then later, of course, of Murillo. But he was, in some ways, always the most interesting of them. He had such a strange background. So he was born in this little town not far from Seville called Fuente de Cantos, and I was once lucky enough to make a film about him. And I went to Fuente de Cantos, which is, it looks like a kind of village you get in a spaghetti western starring Clint Eastwood. Little whitewashed Mexican-looking houses, tiny streets. You never see a car. You can still imagine people riding down the tiny main road on a horse. Tiny place, and his house is still there, believe it or not. So you can make a kind of pilgrimage to Fuente de Cantos and see his house. And interestingly, his father, by the way, who was called Luis de Zurbarán, he was a haberdasher, so he sold cloth and textiles to the rich. That was basically his job. And amongst the things that we'll be seeing in this show at the National Gallery will be Zurbarán's female martyrs, because he painted a lot of female martyrs, and there's sequences of them, groups of them all over the place, including some in Britain. But the female martyrs, apart from the fact that they're so beautifully done and mysterious in that Zurbarán way, what's wonderful about them is their clothes. So they're all wearing different high-quality clothing. And the story about that is that basically Zurbarán used to use these pictures of female martyrs to show off his dad's goods. So his dad's textiles and the stuff he was selling in the haberdashers would appear in Zurbarán's paintings, and people would pop up and say, "Oh, I love what that St. Agatha or that St. Lucy is wearing. Where can I get that?" And they'd say, "Oh, it's that bloke in Fuente de Cantos." So off they went and bought it.
Do you know who else was the son of a great draper? Do you know?
Off the top of my head, let me see. Son of a draper.
Great painter of drapery?
Into drapery. Would that be Veronese, the greatest painter of drapery at all time?
Or Van Dyck? Oh. And there's another one for you to choose from. Thomas Gainsborough, both sons of drapers. So I think there's something in this. Zurbarán, Van Dyck and Gainsborough, sons of drapers.
Yeah.
Brilliant at painting drapery, because, of course, they would have been surrounded by rich fabrics and seeing the shadows fall into the crisp folds from an early age. Well,
it's very true. It was something to maybe do in a future podcast, the Sons of Drapers. But, of course, so apart from the female martyrs with their flashy, beautiful clothes and their rich brocades, another thing this show's going to focus on, it's got over 50 paintings by Zurbarán coming apparently, is his paintings of St. Francis. So there's a great St. Francis in the National Gallery, and he's painted several of them. And they are indeed remarkable for the way he painted the cloth, although in this case it's not flashy female brocades and silks and satins. It's this hardcore, monastic, grey-brown cloth that the Franciscans used to wear, because St. Francis was always sworn into poverty, wasn't he? And that was one of his big storylines, that he gave away all his clothes, because he was the son of a rich man. He gave away all his clothes, a bit like Zurbarán, I guess. Maybe that's another connection, by the way, with Zurbarán and St. Francis, because St. Francis gave away his clothes. Zurbarán used to sell his dad's clothes in his paintings, and in his paintings of St. Francis, he seems to always emphasise the humbleness, the humility, the plainness of the monastic robes that St. Francis is wearing. So you often see him praying, and it's just him, just the single figure of St. Francis, often looking up to the heavens, and you hear sort of Jesus' voice without actually being able to hear it, it's somehow implied. They're fabulous paintings. I mean, there's a whole range of St. Francis by Zurbarán, so they're all going to be in the show. And obviously, because he was Francisco de Zurbarán, that was also his name saint, so there's lots of reasons for him to connect. And Zurbarán's religiosity is, I think, the overwhelming thing to notice about his work, really. He used to work for monastic orders mainly, so although he did work for the Spanish monarchy, his chief patrons, certainly in the onset of his career, were these monastic orders that sprung up all over Spain at the time, and they gave him work when others wouldn't. And his work, I think he was just by temperament and spirit, he was a very holy man, and man who really believed spiritually deeply in the religious stories he was trying to tell. So he invented fabulous ways of doing it. So with the St. Francis's, it's all about a single figure locked in this brilliant divine empathy with an unseen Christ, an unseen Jesus. But his other sorts of paintings, the bigger biblical scenes, and they're exciting too. One of my favourites is hanging in the Prado, and it's the story of two Peters. So one of them is St. Peter, our famous St. Peter, and the other is St. Peter Nolasco, who was the founder of another religious order called the Mercedarians. And the Mercedarians were set up basically to rescue poor Catholics from imprisonment by Muslims and the Islamic faith. So this was part of that awful crusade still, the whole battle going on between Muslims and Christians. And so a lot of Christians were captured, and the Mercedarians were set up to rescue them and save them and look after them. And Zurbarán worked for them for quite a while. But in this painting of the apparition of St. Peter to St. Peter Nolasco, St. Peter, of course, was crucified upside down. So in the painting in the Prado, you've got an upside-down St. Peter hanging there looking very dramatic and miraculous. And the St. Peter Nolasco, the saint who founded the Mercedarians, kneeling down before him and praying. And this combination of an upside-down saint and the kneeling figure, the simplicity of it, but also the weirdness of it, such a weird painting. That is in essence what Zurbarán brought to the party. Something really different, something distinctive, something that is absolutely imbued with a sense of the sacred, but is also highly unusual. And one other speciality we should quickly mention before we move on. You know what that is, don't you, Bendy? His other speciality.
The light?
The light's good, yeah, the light's good. Anything else, quickly?
No, sorry.
Still lifes. Still lifes, Bendy. Zurbarán also turned out to be one of the great painters of Spanish still lifes.
Does the dead sheep, is that right?
He did the sheep, the great Agnus Dei. So that was the sort of Easter image of Jesus Christ. So Christ said, I am the Lamb of God and I'm dying for you. And so that became the Easter image. So Zurbarán implies all that with just this image of a lamb that's been trussed and is lying on a table, and very bare and stark, but also, again, imbued with this sense of it representing Christ dying on the cross in order to save us. That's the meaning of that picture. And his other still lifes, I think, are all tied in with that. So he's a specialist in the very bare, simple still lifes. You just see some vessels on a shelf, or you just see a lemon, a little plate. There's a series of sort of very, very beautiful, simple plates with just maybe a lily on it and things. So that spirit of the Lentian still life, as it was called, because, Lent was this period when you were supposed not to eat a lot and you're supposed to basically cut down on everything. And there's a whole sort of series of Spanish still lifes that try to capture that atmosphere of self-abnegation that you're meant to go through during the Lent period before Easter. So he's a specialist in that. And they're going to do a whole load of that as well in the show. So, oh my God, it's going to be so exciting. Everybody abroad, international visitors, come May, come over and see the big Francisco de Zurbarán exhibition at the National Gallery. It's going to be wonderful, Bendy.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I personally prefer my still lives to be a little bit more bountiful, Wild. I prefer those 17th century Dutch ones full of cheese. I need to have some cheese in my still life. Not sure about this Lenten idea.
Oh, Bendor, you've got you're banging on about what a spiritual person you are all the time, going on about the divine light of Gothic cathedrals, and then you bring cheese into an argument about the build up to Easter. Honestly, that you're incorrigible. What else have you got on the plate then, Mr. Cheese?
You just give me a thought of having a cheese fondue inside a Gothic cathedral. I think that would be it. That would be my apotheosis. Well, I'd be shooting up. You couldn't keep me down.
Oh my God! If you do that, you'll be nominated for the Turner Prize or something, won't you? mean, that is such a crazy contemporary idea. It's most unlike you. I don't like to hear you talking like this. It's against the character that I know and have lovingly sat opposite for all these years doing this podcast. I don't want to be eating cheese in a Gothic cathedral, let alone a cheese fondue. Okay, move on.
I'm going to start a new religion, gluttony. Now, okay, so I'm going to take us overseas, actually, to a city almost in the middle of Germany, called Kassel. Have you been to Kassel in Hesse?
Yes, I have. I'm gonna, they have the big modern art exhibition there, probably the biggest of all, the Documenta. Every 5 years they have a big thing in Kassel. So I go there for that, yeah. But they've got a lovely little museum as well, and they have old master art too.
Have you been up to the museum, the Wilhelmshohe Palace?
I have been. It's been a while because the Documenta is only every 5 years. So I think the last one, I missed the last one. So it would have been 10 years ago when I went. It was last there, yes.
Okay, it's well worth a trip. It's an amazing place. This palace built by one of the Landgraves of Hesse called William IX. He decided that he had to have a palace overlooking his city, and then he had to have a completely straight road to go from the middle of the city to the palace. And I think this thing's sort of 3 or 4 miles long. You can see it almost from space. There's this sort of normal city, and then there's an extraordinary avenue up to a palace on the hill. Anyway, it is now full of the most wonderful old master paintings world, and the Old Master Gallery in Kassel is known for its collection of Rembrandts. So, from May this year, they are having an exhibition on Rembrandt. And the reason I'm excited by this, it's about early Rembrandt. So the show is called Rembrandt 1632, Creation of a Brand. Now, this for me is one of the most extraordinary and slightly underappreciated moments in Rembrandt. This question of how he goes from painting these little kind of brightly coloured, not quite stick-like figures, but these scenes of little brightly coloured people doing various kind of Dutch genre things, which he paints in Leiden, kind of in the manner of his sometime teacher, Peter Larsman. How he suddenly, in the space of only basically a year or two, transforms himself from that to becoming the Rembrandt we know and love, the painter of mysterious shadows across faces, and transforming his palette from very brightly coloured to sort of muted greys and browns. These moments of transition in artists, Wilde, I always find tremendously exciting and revealing, don't you think?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the difference between an early Rembrandt, which almost could almost be something by his pupil Gerrit Dou, couldn't they? They're small, they're very kind of minutely detailed, and have no sense of that breadth and boldness and big religious thunderous meaning of the later stuff. And he does seem to become a completely different artist. I've always put it down to the discovery of something by him. So when he goes to Amsterdam, he must have seen something that, as it were, dramatically changed his direction. And if I had to pick a name out of the hat, I would say the name would be Caravaggio. I think somewhere or other, the influence, the impact of Caravaggio made his art bigger, bolder, filled it with light, filled it with belief, above all, in a very dramatic way. Something of that sort. It feels to me as if there must have been some Damascus road that he travelled down, and something must have happened, because it is too dramatic a change to be understood purely as a easy development.
Yes, I see that argument. Simon Schama, of course, thinks it was also Rubens that Rembrandt was looking at. But I have to say, I'm slightly suspicious of it's tempting, but I'm suspicious of the kind of one artist sees another, has a kind of eureka moment, and then embarks in a new direction. I could see how art historically, if you were writing art history in the form of a picture book, that would make sense. But in fact, one of the reasons I'm really looking forward to going to seeing this show is I think Rembrandt's process of discovery and transformation happens slightly earlier, actually when he's in Leiden, so just before he moves to Amsterdam. And I think it comes out of competition with his studio mate and friend, fellow artist, Jan Levens. And I tell you, well, just to end this little discussion about the show in Kassel, one of the reasons I'm really excited to see it is that I saw online the curators of the show a couple of months ago put out an appeal for a lost likeness of Rembrandt. And this is a tiny little on-panel head of Rembrandt. And it looks like a preparatory study, or related to some way, quite a famous self-portrait of Rembrandt, which is in the Rijksmuseum. which we'll put up on YouTube for people to see. It's an early picture, sort of around about 1632, and it is taken as one of the kind of rocket launch moments when Rembrandt is suddenly transforming himself with this idea of Caravaggesque, even plays of light across the face. The reason I think, well, this is exciting, that the curators are trying to find this lost image, is that it's an image I've been looking for years and years and years. Ever since a few years ago, I made a program about Rembrandt for the BBC, one of our episodes of Britain's Lost Masterpieces, about another version of this picture in National Trust property in Knightshays in the southwest of England. And my thesis at the time was that there'd been debates about, which one of these self-portraits was in fact the one by Rembrandt. And the consensus now is that it's the one in the Rijksmuseum. And the consensus before has shifted from an example in Kassel itself, sometimes the Knightshays one and sometimes this other one. My thesis, is that there's not only one. And in fact, they may all be by Rembrandt. And if they are, you can actually plot him transforming from the person of little bright colours to the later Rembrandt of dark mystery and shadow. And it's actually a process of discovery and experimentation using his own face as a model, which of course is perfectly acceptable for an artist to do. So I'll be going over to Kassel as soon as the show opens with great excitement, about hoping they've found this lost picture. And if they haven't, we'll put the picture online. And if any other listeners have got it in their attic wild or their downstairs bathroom, please let us know.
Yeah, sell it to me, please, and I'll happily show it to Bendy and see what he says. Yeah, I mean, this is this whole Rembrandt research project thing, isn't it, where they brought down the numbers of real Rembrandts from hundreds to many fewer, and now that's being reversed, isn't it? So people like you are saying that there are actually more Rembrandts, not less, and that we should look at them more generously. But I'll tell you what, one thing, do you remember we had our great forger on, Sean Greenhouse, on one of the podcasts a few weeks ago. He's produced a few Rembrandt self-portraits. The one you're looking for, it's not by any chance on copper, is it? A little copper panel?
No? I know the one you're thinking of, Wild.
No, because Sean, his Rembrandts, the fake ones, were always on copper, and the reason was that apparently if you paint on copper, it just can't be aged. So whatever you do to it, you can't examine what age it was painted in. So copper's the forger's chosen form of faking an old master. So any copper Rembrandts out there, the chances are they were made by Sean Greenhouse, who made several of them. But that sounds great. I definitely want to get along to Kassel and see that. That sounds very exciting. But I'm going to go somewhere sunnier next, Bendy, because for me, if I had to pick like one thing that will make 2026 really special, it's the fact that it's a Biennale year in that great Biennale city of Venice. Yes, 2026 will see the 61st Venice Biennale. I always go, always find it absolutely marvellous event, exciting event. Not always a great art event, but always an exciting event. Have you been to the wonderful Venice Biennale, Bendy?
Well, this is a rare moment when I can say, actually, I made a television program for the BBC about the Biennale.
Oh.
Have you made one of those?
I've made I hate to say this, but I have
right,
made a few.
made more than one.
But they've all been short. How about that? Yeah. But I go a lot. Yeah. In fact, one of the very first, when I started being an art critic, which is a long time ago, I worked for a newspaper here called The Guardian. So I'm now at the Sunday Times, but for 10 years I was the art critic of The Guardian. And almost literally a couple of months after I got the job of being the art critic, they said, "Oh, look, the Venice Biennale's on. You must go and cover it." So I remember they gave me 150 quid and said, "Right, you go and cover the Venice Biennale." I go to Venice Biennale. I walk out the airport. I get into a water taxi, which looked very welcoming, straight outside the airport. And I said, "Take me to Venice." So they take me to Venice. And the guy says to me, "Right, that'll be 110 quid. So yeah, I had 30 quid left, or 40 quid left to last me the entire week in Venice to cover the Biennale. But I've been coming back ever since. It's an exciting event. I bet you loved it when you were there, right?
I did, although I was making a program with Alistair Sook, and the conceit of the program was, that I was showing him the old mastery stuff, Tintoretto, Titian, all that kind of stuff, and he was supposed to be impressing me with the modern and contemporary stuff, and I was supposed to be poo-pooing it, and happily we would meet somewhere in the middle, and guess what? We did. Yeah. So all was well.
Well, this is it. You see, the Venice Biennale the reason it's such a glorious event is because it's set in Venice, and therefore you do get both worlds. So, you can go and see the Tintorettos, you can go and see the Titians, and all you've got to do is sort of step off the Biennale track and you're in this glorious church full of old master art. And of course, Venice itself is this stupendous setting for an art experience. For me, somehow, the moment you get there and you step out of your last car, step onto your first boat, you're transported to this other world. And somehow the fact there are no cars, you've got to walk everywhere or take a boat, turns Venice into this slightly otherworldly experience. It just removes it from the everyday, the quotidian. And that is the world where art exists, isn't it? Art is about this other world, sort of a side next door to the quotidian, part of the everyday world, but somehow not the same thing as the everyday world. So Venice transports you. I love going to the Biennale. I never miss it. I always go. And this year should be interesting. It's got a theme. They always have a kind of theme for the Biennale. And this year's theme is in minor keys, which I quite like the sound of. It's a musical term, isn't it? So it refers to the way that some music is in a minor key rather than a major key.
I love a minor key. Yeah. I like sad music. Sad music always cheers me up, so I like a minor key.
Yes. Well, it's not just sad, but it also tends to be more poetic keys, something more difficult, something more troubling. So it's about, that's the idea for the whole Biennale, and all kinds of artists will be responding to that. So what happens at the Biennale? International visitors, you probably know this already, but all the big countries have a pavilion, so they have a space, they choose an artist, the artist shows their work, and most of those pavilions are in this thing called the Giardini, the Biennale Gardens. So that's the main location you go to see the different countries, Britain, Germany, France, America. They all have their pavilions and they have their chosen artists displaying their wares. So that's really interesting. In the old days, you used to really get an international sense there. So I remember, you go into the Afghan pavilion, and in the old days, you'd see carpets, beautifully woven Islamic carpets. Well, those days have kind of finished, and these days, pretty much everybody in the international art world is making art that feels like international art, but there are regional differences, and it's still exciting. There's another show which is in the Arsenale area, so the Aperto exhibition it's called, where you've got a big mixed theme show of all the most interesting contemporary artists. So basically, if you want to catch up with what art is up to, you go to the Venice Biennale. And rather tragically, the curator, there's always like a big curator who selects everything. The curator this time was a lady called Koyo Kou, and she had made quite a reputation for herself. She was a black African curator who was born in Cameroon, and she'd been putting on a lot of exhibitions of black art and various indigenous art forms from around the world. So I suspect we're going to see quite a lot of that at the Biennale.
So you said it was tragic. Did something happen to the curator?
Oh, the curator died. Yeah, she died. She died this year. It was very sudden. I think it was in May that she died, and nobody knows quite what happened. But I think it was one of those really devastating cancers that got her. But so in a tribute to her, they've kept up her ideas. They've selected the artist that she was going to select, and this whole idea of in minor keys is hers. But there will be this underpinning to the whole event of a great sadness about her passing. So that's something indeed to remember.
Didn't I see in the news that Donald Trump has somehow got involved with the American entry? Is that possible?
God almighty. And how? Yes, indeed. I mean, the Americans had chosen somebody else, but then recently that was ripped up by instructions from the White House. They said that the American pavilion, which is usually one of the wildest pavilions there, I mean, the one thing that the American pavilion could always be relied upon is to do something that is exceedingly un-Donald Trumpy in atmosphere and tone.
Is it going to be covered with those gold plastic adornments? Is it going to be Donald Trump himself?
This is what we all feared, that it was going to make it look like the ballroom in the White House.
Do it, Donald, do it.
Look, if he had a chance, I bet that's exactly what would have happened there. But no, they didn't. So they got rid of the old ideas for it, and they launched a kind of search for a suitable artist whose work represented and emphasised traditional American values, I think was how it was phrased. So, of course, if you're looking in the art world for that, you're not going to find many people, I'm afraid, because it's just not that sort of it's not that sort of world. But they alighted on an artist called Alma Allen, who's a sculptor. I don't know his work at all. I'll be honest with you, I've never heard of him before. but he apparently works in Mexico and he does blobby abstraction. So could have been worse. It could have been pictures of Trump. It could have been gold statuettes, and he could have tried to make the whole thing look like the new White House ballroom. He doesn't do that. He makes these organic blobby sculptures from wood sometimes, but out of bronze. And I think basically they don't mean anything at all, as far as I can tell. They're just abstract shapes. So maybe they're just
well, it sounds to me like it'll fit in very nicely at the Biennale. It says
it'll
cruelly.
It's going to be uncontroversial, I think. But listen, we can skip past the American Pavilion. There'll be lots of other stuff that will be interesting. There'll be Venice to go to. There'll be all those lovely churches to visit, and that's going on basically between May and November. So international visitors, get yourselves to Venice between May and November, see the fabulous 61st Venice Biennale, and I'll see you there. Bendy, what else is on?
I'm very tempted, Wild. Can I come and stay with you?
You can come and stay with me, as long as you pay for the dinners.
and the river and the water taxis, yeah. Okay. My final choice, Wild, actually, I'm going to shock you. I'm going to go for a 20th century artist.
Oh.
And this is an exhibition. I can do it.
Wash your mouth out, Bendy. I don't believe you said that.
It's an exhibition on Joan Erdley, Scottish painter, who sadly is no longer with us, but they're having a big retrospective here in the National Gallery of Scotland called Joan Erdley, Nature of Painting, and that's opening in April 2026. Have you heard of Joan Erdley, Well?
I have heard of her. I've seen her work. Good. I can't claim to be very knowledgeable about it, but yeah, she's played on the edges of my vision of the contemporary art world. So yes, I know she's a delightful painter.
Went to the Glasgow School of Art in the 1940s, and up here in Scotland they did sort of cling on to the traditional way of teaching art and oil painting far longer than down south in England. And I think there's a generation of Scottish artists that come out of particularly the Glasgow School of Arts in that mid-century period, and Joan Erdley is one of them, who actually take oil painting to a new place. Now, if you think about it, people have been painting in oil since, goodness knows what, the 13th century in Europe, in Western art, and there were not many ways you could advance it and do something new with it, but Joan Erdley does that, and particularly in two ways. I'm looking forward to seeing her landscapes. So from around about the mid-50s onwards, she suddenly decided she wanted to paint the sea and landscapes, and she moved to a little tiny fishing village on the east coast of Scotland, just below Aberdeen, called Cataline. And she just, a bit like Turner actually, she just stuck herself occasionally on a cliff top, on the beach, no matter what the weather was, no matter what time of day it was, and she just absorbed herself in the truth of what she saw around her and painted it in the most extraordinary and modern and original ways. I'm looking forward to seeing the landscapes. I'm really genuinely, I'm not just saying this because she's Scottish and I live in Scotland, but I think she's one of the great painters of Britain of the 20th century. Also, well, worth seeing if you come up are her pictures of children. She was also a brilliant painter of children. And in order to encounter some of the most vivid children she could find, she, and for other reasons, of course, she ended up with a studio in a tenement in a very poor part of Glasgow called Townhead. And she would invite these little slum children up to her studio and paint them sometimes in very sort of original ways on scraps of sandpaper, in pastel or in oil as well. And she just managed to capture that sort of irrepressibility of youth, no matter what your circumstances. And that sort of special Glasgow character always shines through. So she's a brilliant painter of children and landscapes. She died tragically quite young, but this is going to be a big show and really, really worth seeing, making the trip to Edinburgh Fall.
You're making us sound like the Scottish Anna Mendieta, sort of same dates. Lover of nature, an artist who painted herself. Sounds interesting. I see 10 years ago, the old Waldy and Bendy would have poo-pooed that because I was an out-and-out modernist, and there were a lot of people painting in England in the middle of the 20th century who just seemed old-fashioned and seemed not really to be in the race. They weren't really part of the modern art story. But we've now realised, of course, that a lot of those artists were doing wonderful things, particularly female artists. And the old told Waldemar Illustrator was wrong to be snobbish about them. So I guess I'll have to go along to this with more of an open heart. Sounds very interesting. Good luck to her. Oh, by the way, just very, very quickly, so before we leave, that's it really, except for one thing. Do you remember we had a little item on the show about Amrita Sher-Gill, the Indian artist whose work we loved, and who in some ways is comparable to Joan Early, what you've just been describing there. She found her own style, painted Indian art. Well, there is a show, do you remember we mentioned there's a show coming of her work, and there is indeed, and that's on between March and September at the Drents Museum, which is in a town called Assen, which is just north of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Town of Assen, big Amrita Sher-Gill show, so that's something else for international visitors to add, unless of course you are in Holland already, in which case all you've got to do is pop up the road to Assen. So listen, that and lots of other things make 2026 an exciting sounding year. I'm going to spend as much of it as I can going around art galleries, because let's face it, there is nothing better than art, and art never lets you down, and it's all going to be absolutely stimulating and exciting. So for me, on that very, very optimistic note, it's welcome New Year. Open the doors, I'm ready to rush in.
Happy New Year, everyone, and see you very soon.
Waldy and Bendy.